Yeah, that's what I want. That's what I want.
All right, we'll go ahead
Make it
and get
happen.
started. Thank you for coming and welcome. This is your style guide is an API. My name is Luke Wertz. I work for Palantir.net. Palantir.net is a full services web firm. We provide design, strategy, and development services for clients in all different kinds of sectors and vectors. I wanted to spend some time today talking about what I'm currently working on in a project and some future state things that we're working towards. Before we begin, though, I have two confessions that I have to make. The first is that this is very much a journey for us. Greg LaRue is here. He's on my team on the project that I'm currently working on and that a lot of this material comes from. Some of this is currently implemented. Some of this is just laying a foundation for things that we know will come in the future. So bear with me as some of this is forecasting, some of this is current state. The second, it's unfortunate, but it's true. Some style guides were definitely hurt in the making of this presentation. What is a style guide? A style guide is meant to be an encapsulation of a brand or an identity of an organization. It's really meant to hold and be the canonical source of information for the visual language that an organization might use. It should have things like how and when is it appropriate to use a logo? What typefaces are appropriate? What does it look to juxtapose two different components next to each other? And how do those things interact with each other? All of this should be gathered together, all this information, and stored in one easy to access place so that the people who are actually using the style guide to do the communication on behalf of an organization have documentation. Ultimately, your style guide should be documentation. Within our industry and certainly within Palantir, we talk about more than just style guides. We talk about living style guides. So what is a living style guide as opposed to just a regular old not living style guide? A living style guide is meant to be useful and to continue to be updated after the launch of the flagship site, whatever that flagship site or product might be. The living style guide is meant to exist in parallel with that and to continue to be updated. Living style guides are useful across all different types of organizations and organizations of different sizes. We've used living style guides in institutions of higher education. We've used living style guides in government projects, in large product-focused organizations. The thing that I think makes living style guides really useful to an organization is if they have this concept of a microsite, right? So this should be a fairly familiar term. You've got your main, right, domain.com, and then maybe they also have 1 or 1,000 other domains that map to other services or products or departments or organizations or groups or that one faculty member who really insists on having a vanity URL. All of these things should encompass and should play by the rules defined in the style guide. By having a living style guide that adapts with an organization over time, these organizations stay current. The smaller microsites stay current with the main flagship site. The dirty secret of living style guides is they're usually killed off. And they're usually killed off right after the launch of the flagship site. Has anybody here ever killed off a living style guide? Yep, all the Palantir's hands go up, and a number of others too, yes. It's like, it's just the reality. Maintaining a style guide is work and does take effort and energy and planning. Ian Feather of The Lonely Planet talks about the death of style guides probably a lot more eloquently than I can. I need to refocus my browser here, sorry. He talks about when style guides stop being updated, how they fall out of sync with applications. The style guide has lost its purpose at that point. You can't look to the style guide as a canonical source of information. You can read more about it on the Lonely Planet technical blog, and we'll come back to that towards the end of the presentation. The thing is, though, style guides conceptually have very historical roots. The problem space isn't really all that new to us, who are front-end developers. Maybe the third disclaimer at the front should have been, I'm not a front-end developer. I just work with really good front-end developers. So. But the problem space here isn't new. We've been working with the concept of separation of content from layout, content from design, for a long time. Consolidating design and layout decisions into single places where they can be updated, into single CSS files, defining markup that can be used and reused. If you blink, it's 1999 again, and CSS is all the new hotness, right? Does anybody here remember CSS Zen Gardens? The whole point of Zen Gardens was to show that structured markup could look very, very different depending on the CSS that's served with it. That was the intent and the purpose. We're kind of doing similar things now with living style guides. We just have a lot more process around it and some newer and fancier and arguably cooler words. Let's back up, though, for just a minute and take a look at what it might look like in a living style guide to work with a specific component. Because style guides nowadays, modern style guides, focus very much on component-driven development, where you're isolating specific pieces of a page and working and iterating on that design. So I'd like to start off by showing a header. This is a screen grab from a style guide that I'm working with right now. And you can see that it's kind of hard to see, but there's three things that go into the rendering of this header, right? You have the title, visiting and exploring. To the left of the title there is an icon. And the thing that's hard to see, I think, is the gray placeholder image that's behind that. You can trust me, it's a picture. The point of this is that you can overlay this header over an image. And this is a self-contained thing. But as a header, and it serves a specific purpose, there can be permutations of this. So here's another permutation of the same type of information within this style guide. This header, you can see, is visually different. That green bar expands to fill the full vertical space of the background image, and you have a title. These things are serve the same purpose in why they are developed, but they may be used in slightly different ways in different places on the site. The point here isn't their visual distinctions. The point is that there's optional elements in each of these things. And those optional elements represent data structures that are required in order to render these. The optional elements in this first one are actually the background image and the icon. You can actually render a permutation of that first header without the background image entirely, and it will still function as designed. In the second one on this slide, we have the background image as optional here. You could also add an optional icon, as we have in that top one. But we also have a data property with this header to indicate that it should be the large variant. So that's just a design choice that's made at the time when this thing is being rendered. Whoever's writing that code, whether it be a front-end engineer or back-end engineer, to pull in that Twig file is saying, I want the large version of this thing. Make sense? Two components. They serve a similar purpose. They may just have different options. So if we were to take this and step back in time to maybe circa 1999 or before, how we might have done this in the past is that these things would actually just be HTML that's hard-coded into a file that's a .html file on your web server. A user requests it and it's served, right? There's probably some monolithic CSS, or maybe it's table-based or inline CSS, but the CSS exists. Maybe these headers are includes. Maybe you're doing something cool like PHP includes, maybe not. But the thing to recognize here is throughout the history of the process of designing these things, we're driving more and more towards component-based designs, making these things encapsulated and smaller. So our current processes today include things like Twig or template files. We happen to use Twig. We're using Pattern Lab. You could use any number of tools to encapsulate your templates. And in the case of these headers, they're actually the same Twig file, just with different properties, different options. Our CSS certainly isn't monolithic anymore. It's structured and there's organization to it. It's compiled or pre-compiled, depending on when you're looking at the build process. These components are what drive the style guides today. So in recognizing that we're going towards this component-based all the things, I want to talk a little bit about the foundation that my team has been working on laying and how we're looking towards the future and use of a style guide as an API. So the first thing that we tackled as a community and as an organization is the separation of the style guide, of the theme, of the look of the site from the actual site itself. Convincing an organization of the need to have a visual language that supersedes just its flagship website or its primary product is crucial. You have to be able to talk about the visual components of an organization. Really, its visual identity, separate from any specific variant or deviation from its flagship site. So, convincing an organization to have a separate project for its style guide and to revision it and release it. Use something like Semver to actually document your backward-breaking changes. What might a backward-breaking change in a style guide be? We'll get to that in a couple of slides here. The point, though, isn't the specific tool that you use. It's just that the style guide should be a separate thing. So whether you're using Pattern Lab, as indicated here, or Jekyll or Suppress, any of these tools, that it doesn't matter as long as it's a separate thing that you can call from your project. And whatever that process is, whatever that tool is, it should have a build process associated with it. So if you're writing less or Sass for your CSS, there needs to be a tool to actually build that and make that built tool available to any system that wants to ingest or use the CSS or the artifacts from your style guide. The reason style guides often die is because people fail at that step. at the step of making that build process and the build artifact something that's reusable and can be ingested separately from the flagship website. So if your style guide is embedded in your flagship site or your primary product's website, it makes it really hard to pull that out to be reused elsewhere. That's why it's critical that you make the decision early on to separate your style guide from the first thing that's going to consume or use the style guide. Make sense? Okay. So you have your style guide. Just tangentially, I don't know if anybody was in Carrie Fisher's presentation in the hour slot before now. I was there. It was a great presentation. You should go catch it on YouTube if you didn't get a chance to see it. But she was presenting on the first part of her presentation was on the role of a front-end developer, and she had this really cool GIF of a person wearing 27 hats, and the hats were colored, and all the different things that a front-end developer does during the day: accessibility testing, writing markup, probably working in designs, writing jQuery or JavaScript code, CSS. I was sitting there thinking to myself, yes, this is exactly why this needs to be a separate project entirely. These people are brilliant. Their work needs to be able to stand on its own, and I shouldn't be muddying it up and muddling with it. So the discipline, the front-end discipline is really coming into its own right now. Anyway, that's just a plug for Carrie's presentation. The second thing to realize here is if your style guide is a completely separate thing, you need a way to actually use it. So when you instantiate your Drupal 8 site or whatever you're building your flagship site on, or the first site that's ingesting your style guide, you need to treat your style guide as a dependency, just like many of the other dependencies that you're going to be using. And in my workflow, this means composer require. And I'm literally just doing composer require and then the build artifact from the style guide. So this is how I get the files, that build artifact from my style guide into my project so that I can leverage those assets and use them. I'll warn you, when you do this, you probably want to make sure that you're symlinking to those files in your custom theme rather than copying those files over. I've worked with enough Drupal developers who have hacked core to know that this is a pattern, right? If you're copying those files in, you're going to be tempted to modify them. Don't. It's a separate project. If those files need to be modified, go modify them in their own Git repo, and then let those changes permeate back to you. Make those changes available to anybody who's using the system. Don't hack core. Upstream changes are best. So if you have your style guide and you have your dependency, your dependency manager, whatever that is, ingesting your style guide build artifact, you then need a way to actually leverage that artifact in your system. This probably means writing some glue code. If you've written much code, if you've written any code that integrates multiple systems, you're probably familiar with glue code. It has a very distinct smell. It smells like glue. You can usually pick it up. What this might look like if your glue code smells like my glue code is you're going to have some custom settings and some setup work that has to happen at your theme layer. And then you're probably going to also have some modules, one or more modules, that are useful for setting up the data structures that are needed by the theme layer or by the style guide. In this case, and in the examples I'll show, I'm going to be talking about atoms, molecules, and organisms. This is terminology that comes from Pattern Lab. If you're not familiar with Pattern Lab, it is a component-based design system. It's software, but it's also a philosophy, kind of like Git flow. It's software and a philosophy. It's a way of thinking about your designs to break them down into the smallest indivisible components and then building larger, more complicated components from that. Maps really well to the way my brain works, which is why I really like it. At this point, though, in your process, in your workflow, you're going to have, maybe two separate teams, right? One building the consumer of the thing, the flagship website, one team maybe building the site. You've got two separate projects you're managing. You've got, at least two build systems, one for your style guide, one for your main project. You've got dependency management. You've got custom modules all over the place, maybe they're all encapsulated in one. It's starting to get kind of complicated. I thought it might be useful to pause here and actually take a look at some example glue code for what this might look like. So we'll take a look at some Pattern Lab files. We'll take a look at how we use those Pattern Lab files in a D8 site. So I have proposed here a custom module. This is just the directory structure for this module. And what I have here is a custom module that is really intending to do just two things. This module, the purpose of this module is to treat Drupal like a data store. So get information out of Drupal, get the important information out of Drupal, and then as a processing point, format that data so that it's useful to this system that I'm integrating with. The module file itself is probably where you're doing a lot of the actual gluing of things. You're setting up your high-level templates. You're saying, in my bespoke version of this implementation of the style guide, a blog post looks like this. It has these components in it. This is where you're writing that configuration. That probably doesn't live on your style guide itself, right? Your style guide is component driven. It's not page focused. So in your application, the point at which you're using those components is when you do that configuration to say, my blog is going to be totally unique from every other blog. It's going to have a header with metadata in it. Totally novel. I also have a helpers file. The point of the helpers file is just to be a place to make things globally accessible. You can do things like set up your directory structures. If you have data that's used in all of your atoms and molecules and organisms throughout the site that has to be set up in the same way. Great place to have sort of this catch-all processing point. And then your atoms, molecules, and organisms, in this case, map directly, one-to-one, to atoms, molecules, and organisms in Pattern Lab. So for every Pattern Lab entity, I have an entry in this module that says, okay, Pattern Lab is expecting data in this format. I'm getting data out of Drupal in this format. Process and send. That's it. Looking at a specific one of these, I want to jump to a molecule. The molecule that I want to show you is a molecule to build a link. Just an anchor tag. Hopefully not that complicated. And I'm sorry, I know the two rules of presenting are don't do live demos and don't put code on screen, but here we are. I'm not going to do a live demo, so. Here's a method from my molecules.php file that I just showed you. And you'll notice that I've actually removed all the code here because the code is almost incidental. The thing that's really interesting here, I think, is the doc block itself, which actually sets up and maps for you this is what this version of the style guide is looking for. This is what I have to be able to deliver in order to be useful. And some of these things may be optional, some of them aren't, but the point here is that the data structure for this anchor tag, just an anchor tag, is actually kind of complicated. The rendered thing is going to have a couple of decorator spans. It's going to have an optional third span to contain this info property. There will be separate treatments for if the URL is considered internal or external to the organization. So there needs to be data processing for that. This anchor molecule, this just a link thing, is actually not that straightforward after all. Here's the Twig template that we're using. So we're processing data, we're setting it up, and this is where it's getting used. So throughout this file, you can see each one of those variables is either checked for or utilized in some way. Full disclosure, I have to confess, so this is a Twig file. It comes directly from Pattern Lab. It's symlinked into my theme file. In order to actually make that work, I had to write my own custom Drupal 8 theme engine. Sounds more complicated than it is. The default Twig theme engine in Drupal will only look for files that end in .html, .twig, and Pattern Lab is not compatible with .html, .twig. So I had to write a mechanism for exposing files that end in just .twig to Drupal, register them in the theme registry, and then Drupal handles the rest of the magic. Not that hard, and the thing that I wrote will be open sourced before DrupalCon. So you can just grab that one if it's interesting to you. When I was talking earlier about the style guide needing to be a separate project and have its own revision history, this is why. This is what's important to note here. This one particular property that you can optionally send is not a backward breaking change because we have this if conditional around it. If we didn't have this if conditional around this would be a backward breaking change. Think about it. If you're using version 2 of this file and this if conditional doesn't exist, and then version 3 comes out, you have a new required property. You have to be providing this info property, otherwise you're going to be printing empty span tags. So in order to introduce this new property in a non-backward backward compatible breaking way, we're wrapping this in an if conditional. By wrapping it in an if conditional, if somebody doesn't send this property, no problem. Nothing's printed. No ugly empty span tags, clean markup all the way, it's all good. Does that make sense of what a backward breaking change might look like in a style guide? Anytime you have a property that goes from optional to required, or a new required property, or a property that was required that's no longer required, that breaks backward compatibility. In Semver, that means a full version bump. So from version 3 to 4, if you're just introducing this as a new thing, a new optional component that people can utilize or not, then it's not backward breaking. You go from version 3.0 to 3.1 in semantic versioning. Does that make sense? Okay. So we have our separate project, we got our build systems, we've got our modules, we've got our theme engine, we've got our Twig templates, we've got our data structures, we've got a lot of things. It's starting to get pretty complicated. In thinking about this, it reminds me of my very favorite reality check that I ever got in my professional career, and it came by way of Steve Persh a couple of years ago when he reminded me, all we're really trying to do here is send concatenated strings of HTML to a browser, right? Like, this seems like a whole lot of work just to get some HTML to a browser. I hope that we can think of ways to make this process a little bit simpler. And what do you know? Such a thing exists. APIs are a mechanism of encapsulating pieces of logic and black boxing them. You can take a specific process to say, give me your data, and I will return something that has been processed to you, and you don't have to worry about how that happens. That's the business use case for an API. I was having a conversation with Larry right before lunch. I asked him if he could, in like five minutes or less, explain an API in non-technical terms, and he completely dismantled my definition of an API. So the point of this is, don't ask Larry questions.
Unless you want to know the answer.
Unless you want to know Larry's answer. That's right, Larry. Thank you for that. But Larry's definition actually specifically excluded HTML as a delivery payload mechanism. I'd like to counter that point here. If your style guide is an API, then what better thing to deliver than formatted, structured, known markup? Reasons why this is really useful to an organization. If your organization has 100 microsites and maybe 7 developers spread across those, maybe some of those developers are siloed. Maybe some of those developers are better at accessibility testing than others. So your organization may have 100 websites that all have different levels of accessibility. That can actually be a real risk to your organization. It can result in less business. It can result in lawsuits. Having a single place that has been thoroughly tested for accessibility and is compliant with your brand's visual identity and visual language is incredibly important. So an API is one possible way to do this. Instead of having all of these systems and subsystems that I've been referring to, what might this look like in the future? In the future, this might look like, I'm jumping examples here from the headers of earlier. I'm now continuing forward with the anchor tag. In the future, this might just look like making a simple post request and sending this request to, you might notice, a specific version of my style guide, in this example 3.2. And I'm telling my style guide, hey, I have this information and I want it rendered. Can you tell me how to do that? And the Styleguide API is returning exactly the markup that we need and that we want, and can even do some nifty processing if you want to do things like checks on your language for accessibility. You could actually do that through the style guide and have that all black boxed from your users. The payload that might be returned from this could come in several components. You might have your minified HTML. The CSS and JavaScript might also come back with the same payload, and you can comprise your CSS on the fly. Or imagine for a moment, if you will, the power of something like this coupled with GraphQL, where you could actually describe your entire page content to the style guide and get back your whole page, all marked up for you in a compliant way. This is really exciting to the back-end engineers in the room, I think. I see a couple nodding. What might this system, or what might this process look like at a full page level? We've looked at what this could look like at a molecule, not too complex of an element. To look at a full page view, I actually want to step back and talk more about the foundation, because I haven't gotten the full API implementation yet. I'm working there, baby steps. At the foundation, the transitional state that I find myself in right now, I'm still making calls to an internal system that I'm maintaining. I'm not making external calls, but I am setting up my pages. right? My pages are mine. My pages are bespoke to my implementation of the style guide. So in this case, I'm setting up a node of type my page. Very creative, I know. And my page is a banner. It has a header. It has a body. This is a truncated thing. It may have footers and sidebars. And the point here is that the node is the data store for this information. It's not the theme. All it should be is the discrete elements that are needed, and the style guide should provide the HTML. So in this case, I'm calling out to my helpers, my organisms, my molecules, and those molecules and organisms leverage atoms and other smaller components to return the appropriate markup, the appropriate data. And then in the theme layer, all I have to do is print out my variables. That should be all that the theme layer is doing in Drupal. Now, one of the really nice things about offloading the ownership of the CSS to the style guide from the CMS is that you actually can, at the CMS level, override. And you can do so, and do so with care. You can actually intercept that request and say, oh, this user is authenticated, so I actually want to serve this extra bit of CSS. Maybe that CSS is bespoke to this application and isn't part of the style guide. Upstream changes are always best, though, so maybe those things should be pushed back to the other repository, but maybe not. Maybe you're working in an environment where you have 50 Drupal installs and 1 WordPress install, in which case maybe those WordPress changes don't make their way back into the style guide, and it truly is a one-off. The point here, though, is the vast majority of your page, if not the entirety of your page, should be something that's built by your style guide, where you can do all of your extensive testing and have your accessibility testing, your user testing, and maintain the integrity of the visual identity of your organization. Okay, with that, let me tell you a short story. This might be something that you consider something of a worst case scenario for doing a presentation. I gave a version of this talk to a client a couple of weeks ago. And the purpose of the talk, it was a largely developer-centric audience. The purpose of the talk was to get everybody on board with this future state thing, the thing that we're building towards. I was super pumped, super excited, gave an amazing presentation, if I may say so. At the end, I said, does anybody have any questions? And Jess Constantine, one of the client's developers, raised her hands and said, oh, so you mean kind of like Rizzo? And I was completely deflated in that instant because I thought that I had dreamed this whole thing up myself. But as it turns out, the good folks at Lonely Planet have a product that they call Rizzo, R-I-Z-Z-O. And this is their interpretation of a similar thing. They don't call it a style guide API, they call it a component UI API. It uses a technology stack that is foreign to me, but is very interesting. But I would encourage you, if I know a lot of what I've talked about today is future state. If you want to see this in production today, check out some of the stuff on the Lonely Planet technical blog. They're doing some really innovative, they're very smart people over there. I like them a lot. To recap, in summary here, let your style guides live. They're useful to your organization, and they can be made more useful as time goes on and as you have more and more web properties. Your style guide should be considered a single source of truth, which means it needs to be updated. It's a lot of work. Nobody likes updating the documentation. That's not true. Some people like updating the documentation. Larry. But but not everybody does. It can be work, and it's part of a culture that you have to foster within your organization. I propose that the best way to incentivize people to keep the style guide up to date is to make everybody dependent on it. If everybody's dependent on it, then everybody has a horse in the race, I think is the saying. Like, everybody has a reason to make sure that it's updated. And lastly, centralize your logic. Only have one way to render a particular type of link across your organization. Your users will thank you, your developers will thank you, your front-end developers will thank you. It's a good thing in practice. So that's all I have for today. We've got about 5 minutes left, I think. Mm-hmm. So if anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to take them. Yeah.
So if your style guide is returning minified HTML, I think I missed the part where you're able to sub the variables that come from Drupal back into that.
So in the example I showed, the request that was being made was a post request, an HTTP post request, similar to when you submit a form online. So I'm actually sending data to the server saying, here are the variables I want you to process, and the thing I want returned is, in that case, it was a call-out link. So a particular type of link. You could also use the same type of system to make GET requests. So if your organization has a particular set of logos that has to appear in all the footers across all of your web properties, this is pretty common in higher ed. All the departments need to have the college and the university logo, and they have to be a certain distance apart, and they have to be in a particular place. That could just be a GET request, right? Like, I, as the implementer, have no details about this. I just know I need the logos. Get me the logos, please.
Right. Okay, that makes sense. So in summary, Drupal sends its variables to the style guide, which then returns the. Okay.
Exactly.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Have you given consideration to like failover? If you have like a single point of failure at the style guide level, would there be separate templating still available to the systems?
So that's something that has to be handled with any API integration at all, right? And for classic examples of how this can go very, very badly, very quickly, let's look no further than Amazon AWS. If the internet's broken, the internet's broken. Yeah, you absolutely should have redundancy. You should have failover systems. Those are really, really good things. And like I said, in my particular implementation right now, my failover system is that I'm actually symlinking, like I'm pulling the files down into my local project and symlinking to them. So they ship with the product. That's not the best, like most elegant system in the world, but it's pretty cheap and quick to deploy. But yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah.
Why not compile the HTML instead of setting an API request to get the HTML? Why not compile the HTML in some kind of build step?
Well, presumably you don't know what all the variables are, but if you do know what all the variables are ahead of time, what you have is a static site. And there are great ways to have static sites and static site generators, which is just compiled HTML. Does that, bridging that gap, make sense? There's a great D7 module called Static that has some work being done to port it to D8 to actually allow Drupal to generate static sites. It doesn't work with views and panels, but otherwise is great. We've got about 30 more seconds. If anybody has any other questions, if not, I'll be hanging around. Feel free to just find me, and I'd love to chat. My information's on here. Feel free to tweet me. Again, my name's Luke Wertz. I'm an engineer at Palantir. And thank you very much for coming today.